Welcome to the Together for Good podcast, a podcast specifically designed to inspire, challenge, and uplift you during your daily walk of faith. Today's episode, as we make our way through this end of the year, we are bringing back some of the favorite guests of the show, and we have an all-time favorite, Bryan Jaster. Remember him? Bryan Jaster serves as the director of faith formation here at Bethany Lutheran Church. He's been on the podcast a couple of times, but it's been a long while, so I brought Bryan back on to talk about hope. This is a season of perpetual hope, and he and I both have a lot to say about this, just given the years that we've lived through. Bryan and I both started working here at Bethany in 2019, not too long before this whole pandemic thing hit. And so we've had a lot of time to reflect on the idea of hope in the midst of despair. And that's a lot of what we discuss here today, while also giving you a picture of some of the things that we're just so proud of and so excited about that are happening here at Bethany. Even if you aren't a Bethany member, and I know there's a lot of you out there who listen to this podcast, I still think you'll find this conversation interesting as we reflect on Advent as a season of hope and the ways that God brings hope to our despair. As always, friends, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for listening. Throughout this Advent season, as you know, we're bringing back some favorite guests of the show. And additionally, we also find ourselves in a season of Advent, a season of unending hope and joy. And so for both of these reasons, I had to bring Bryan Jaster on the podcast, because who else is more a source of unending hope and joy than Dr. Bryan Jaster? Hey, I'm so glad you're here. I mean, usually you're across the hall, but you're in my office right now.
I'm so glad to be here. So glad to talk about hope and joy in a time of despair, as it comes for some people. Hope and joy persist and remain and come and show up all the time. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and this is going to be a fun one for us to record too, because as we were kind of planning it out, we were realizing that there's a lot here at Bethany, where we both work, that brings us a lot of joy these days, even though there's probably also a lot of cause for despair in this world around us. And so here's where I'm going to start us off, right? That's how we want to talk about today, is just stories of hope during a time of despair. And here's why this is so Advent-y. I think this is super cool. I was reading in my Advent devotional a little bit about kind of some of the circumstances for when Advent was established within the Christian church. And you got to kind of put yourself back in this mindset. Before electricity, right, an agricultural community that depends exclusively on the sun for life. And so these communities, which were in the northern hemisphere, are watching as the sun is spending less and less time in the sky. And I'm sure that for some people, didn't have Wikipedia to look up all this information on. Kids, don't use Wikipedia for your school reports. Come on. But they see the sun disappearing, and then they're thinking, like, wait, is it going to come back? It would have probably been a moment of incredible despair to live in this time like, wait a second, we need that sun for our crops to grow. Is it going to return? And yet the Christian church comes along and puts a holiday right at this time of year and says, yeah, like even though it seems as if despair is creeping in more and more each day, we still have reason to hope. We still have reason to look towards the future with hope and joy. So Bryan, there's my little soliloquy of an intro to all of this, but I want you to tell us some stories about how you are finding hope during times of despair.
Yeah, I mean, despair is so easy to focus on, I think, and all the things we can't do or shouldn't do. And the pandemic feels like it tells the whole story sometimes about our culture and about communities and about the life of the church and about other congregations. But, we sat back sometime like summer and just reflected upon and listened to what God's work has been doing, what God, the Holy Spirit, has been creating. And that just set us in motion to try to come up with experiences for the fall where teens would get to lead, where their leadership and gifts would influence kids, and where we would tell a story at a time and tell it in 5 or 6 different ways. And so we came up with, an exploration station and arts and crafts, and we built a low ropes course downstairs at Bethany that we do different low ropes elements every week. And we thought about singing and how important singing is. Singing is the persistent voice of hope against despair, because when you sing it, something new is proclaimed in you that God wants to put into the world. And so we set up to make Joyful Jam in the center of Wednesday nights. That just kept going. We add a little thing and it would just make for a more life-giving, more robust thing. And suddenly it's like we weren't focusing on things we couldn't do anymore. It's like, well, we could do this week, we could do this week, this week. And then for us on staff, like every Thursday morning after Wednesday night's over, we would spend an hour just celebrating all the little pieces of things, the things kids would do, who was throwing a football, who was jumping up and down during Joyful Jammin', who was just so excited to eat really good food, who in confirmation was learning something they'd never heard first time. They're like, what do you mean? What do you mean God is love? I never heard that before. I'm like, yes. Like so many little things where hope just kept springing forth, and a little bit of hope would build a little bit of hope would build more. And it was like despair was just left in the ashes. And it's not that things haven't been hard. I mean, we had to cancel like one of our Wednesday nights in November because of a COVID scare on staff. That
was really hard on you.
Brutal. I cried about that. I laid down on the ground and I was like, no, we can't. And then I realized, no, we must. But guess what? When we came back, it was that vibrant thing again. And now even like outside, we're doing things more outside, with like the fire pits and the space heaters, like, and doing that outside, it's like it's still warm and people love it. And there's this sense of oasis. There's this sense of like that hope and joy persists in a way that you feel like it's a gentle oasis in the middle of a storm of life. And that alone has been worth all of this.
Yeah, well, and so just for some of our listeners too, who might not know about what we do on Wednesday nights, like right. This was just this didn't exist even before the pandemic.
Right.
At least while you and I have been here at Bethany. Yep. And it was a total shot in the dark. And I remember as we were planning to do the first one, like, we have no idea, right? Like we want to have a meal on Wednesday nights. I'm like, I don't know how cook Denny. We have no idea how many people are going to come. Like this could be 15 or it could be 85, which is about what we're getting each week.
Yeah, because doing things together in person is a little different than the recent past before that. And face-to-face in a time where we've all been pretty disconnected face-to-face and relying on virtual tools and cell phone calls, etc. to do things. And so to come together and to have way more people than we expected also definitely brought us some joy and some hope for like, okay, we've got this now. What can this become?
And that's the exciting part too, is that there's still further ways that we're going to continue to kind of build out from this. But I like what you're saying, too, is that it's not as if we've ignored or aren't aware or pretending that the realities of the pandemic don't exist. That still influences so much of what we do each and every week. And yet, I'm really proud, and I know you are, too, like that we've been able to bring some hope and some joy even as things continue to be difficult and strange and stops and starts all over the place.
Yeah, and what's cool about hope and joy is they seem to be little sprinkles of sunshine in darkness, and that you see a little bit of them at a time, and that for us means that like each week we keep like learning and tweaking a little bit here and there and here and there, and things just kind of happen that we didn't expect, whether it's leaders of some of the stations. Like we had a couple who did a scavenger hunt with some of the groups a couple weeks in a row, and they just were absolutely mind-blowingly awesome. Like things like that happen all the time. And another one is we realized like sometime midsummer that there's a couple of young adults, people who are in their early 20s, 21, 22, 23, 24 years old, who were around. And we looked at each other, Nate and I did, and said, gosh, I wonder like what they get part of. Well, now a few of them lead Joyful Jammin', and others a confirmation guide. And then we have this group called Pub Theology that meets at the Torchy Tacos up the street. And it is so vibrant with hope and joy, but relationship, deep prayer, conversation, and a space where they get to talk about like real matters of faith, of despair, of resurrection, of hope. In a way they don't do any other space.
Exactly. And that's the part we keep hearing from that group too. Because we don't do much of any planning.
No.
You're good about sending a text at least. It's like, hey, it's going to be this Monday night. But that's the part that we keep hearing from them too. Like, it's funny how that little group is a source of hope for them. Mm-hmm. I was talking to somebody this morning who was kind of saying the same thing. He just came for the first time this last Monday night. And he was telling me, he's like, yeah, like it was just so nice to have that level of conversation, because as we go through our daily life, sometimes you don't get to talk about God, just by nature of the work you do. You and I are pretty lucky that topic comes up every now and then. But people working in the finance sphere, or or whatever else it might be, don't have that opportunity. I think it's stuff like that too. I mean, that we don't recognize the gifts that we have sometimes until they're gone. Right? Like the person I was talking to this morning, grew up going to church, all of those good things. But then he was saying, like, hadn't had a lot of connection. And just the chance to sit down and talk with some people about a life of faith was really healing for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing. I mean, another thing we didn't mention too, which we haven't done in a while, is on Sunday mornings at the late service, we have a time within worship where kids have a special time of worship where they go off to a space and they return with some gifts for the whole worship service. We call it children's church, children's worship. And another thing, again, like not seeing a lot of kids face to face in a while, that has been so vibrant and so interesting. And it's very simple. All we do is like they come in, they hear a story, one story read by one teenager. Then they get an arts and craft that helps them to dive deeper into the story. And maybe the arts and craft is a song, or maybe it's something they create that we display in the sanctuary. And then we do some singing and songs. And it's so simple, but man, every time, and even lately, like not only an increasing number of people, but little bits of hope, little bits of joy just grow. You know, it was like when you give them away, there's not enough remaining. It's like, no, it just keeps on growing, which is just fascinating. And we are completely so grateful about that and surprised by it. Like, that's the thing about the last couple of months. It's just I'm continually surprised by how the little gifts that God gives just grow. I mean, even people we talked to it last night who were here for the first time or second time, they were just so thrilled, whether they're just eating together or seeing people. The gratitude and the hope and the joyfulness of the moment was truly powerful. And it seems small when I think about it. But then when I listen to people, I'm like, no, this is a big deal for people. And this is part of God's big deal. Because God's gifts of hope and joy come in the midst of actual despair, actual wilderness, actual pain, actual suffering, and they bring life. And I'm grateful just to be part of little bits of how that life is happening just lately for our community. And for all you that are listening that are part of the community, like the gifts you bring to it are so significant.
And I think one of the things that I've been learning too is how, as you've been kind of describing, is that hope are these little like sparkles that can show up, but then that can build upon each other. And so just to take the time to focus and celebrate, I mean, Bryan's super good at this. At the start of every one of our meetings, he's always like, okay, so what do we have to celebrate from the last week, from the last night? But I just think that that's really valuable and important for setting our mindset as a whole, too. You know, like we still have things to complain about. We've had some very difficult things that we've had to live through recently around here. And yet, like the predominant message always does come back to the hope and the joy that we're finding. And I feel like there's momentum that builds with that's important, right? Like I was literally saying this to my kids last night of all of life is gonna be this kind of conglomerate of good stuff and bad stuff, you know, and nothing is just 100% good, just like nothing is probably just 100% bad. But it's what you choose to focus on that's gonna bubble to the top. And so by taking time to first and foremost be joyful and grateful, I think it changes the whole game. It totally changes the mindset and what you pay attention to and what you notice. And then as a result, where you end up going. And so, I mean, it's just a part that I think a lot about these days because there is so much to feel down about, to struggle with, to complain about. And it can be really easy for that to be the sole focus and to be dragged into despair.
My favorite verse of the Bible, a.k.a. the book of Romans, one of the things that Paul says is not only did Abraham hope against hope to become father of nations, but hope never disappoints. Hope does not disappoint us. And in this time, it feels hard to cling to the kind of hope that makes a difference, that creates a reality that you can hold on to. And I think that's the thing. We've found these things that we get to hold on to. And so that's why perhaps, you know, that God creates actual flesh and blood that we get to hold on to, Jesus himself, who comes at the end of Advent. But all these experiences that, you know, whether it's kids throwing a football outside or singing songs of joyful jamming or people learning at confirmation or coffee crew for high school or Camp Bethany story or, you know, all these little things, the little pieces, the little sparkles of hope create something that makes our world different. And hope changes us and it makes us different. Joy changes us and makes us different. And that is enough. And if I get anything else for Christmas, we've got those. Those are the gifts that I most long for and I most need it, and God freely gives. So, thanks be to God for that.
I'll close with this. It's a pretty cool quote from an author named Henry Nouwen. And it's just exactly this whole idea that we've been talking about too. He says, "There's a very old piece of wisdom that comes from the 4th century monks of the Egyptian desert. Do not combat the demons directly. Instead of paying so much attention to the Prince of Darkness, they advised their disciples to focus on the Lord of Light and thus indirectly, but inevitably, undo the power of the demon." I therefore want to say as clearly as I can that the first and foremost task of the peacemaker is not to fight death, but to call forth, affirm, and nurture the signs of life wherever they become manifest. I think Advent invites us into such behavior, to call forth and affirm the signs of life. Even as the world is technically getting darker, we know that there's hope on the horizon.
So Together for Good podcast listeners, may the hope, may the joy that God brings now be the things that push despair aside and bring forth life in your world and in the whole universe.
Stay in peace, everyone.